So in my previous video I made a passing reference to the fact that the Belgian Grand Prix had been signed up until 2031, which seems like a great thing. A much loved event and much loved circuit is being kept on the calendar and sort of been, well, protected, and people are very excited about that because for whatever reason people love Spa. But the problem is the headline and then the resulting article were a little bit misleading. It was, and again I mentioned this in the previous video, Formula One's way of dressing up good news as bad news. It comes with a free Frogut, which is good, but the Frogut is also cursed. That's bad. But it comes with a free choice of topping. That's good, but the topping contains potassium benzoate. That's bad. And while it looked like Formula One had locked down the circuit to Spa-Francorchamps down for the next 6 years, there was that little bit of small print. The Belgian Grand Prix will not be on the calendar in 2028 or 2030, because, in its infinite wisdom, Formula One has put one of the most loved tracks ever on rotation. Now, it's not actually all doom and gloom. The track will still be on the calendar for 2025, 2026, 2027, 2029 and 2031. That's still 5 times in the next 7 seasons. It's not like it's on for 1 and then off for 3 and back on for 1 again. And in a small way, it's actually best case scenario. Worst case would be on for 2025, off for 26 and 7, back on again in 28, and then back off again. So it's not actually too bad all things considered, but still, it's not perfect. And at the same time, let's not pretend that Spa has been ever present since 1950 either. While it has been on for many years and over those years established itself as a driver and fan favourite, there was no Belgian Grand Prix in 1957 because there were no guarantees the organisers could hold the event in the wake of the Suez crisis, which pushed the fuel prices up. And in the second half of the 1950s and into the 1960s, the grid sizes diminished because the real men who raced back then were concerned about safety. Utter woke nonsense. And then, in 1959, it wasn't held again, before 2 drivers were killed within minutes of each other in 1960. And it would have been 3 drivers killed over the whole weekend if luck had gone a different direction for Sir Stirling Moss. And that might have to be a story time for a future date because it shows how horrific those years were. Then, in the late 1960s, the Grand Prix Drivers Association successfully voted to boycott the Belgian Grand Prix and the Spa circuit altogether due to the safety concerns in the new 3-litre era. The cars had outgrown the track, and Jackie Stewart had had his famous accident at the Master Kink in 1966. And it wasn't just limited to Formula One, because in a 24-hour touring car race on the old layout in 1972, Hans Stuck told his co-driver Jochen Mass, "Look out for body parts at the Master Kink." Mass went out expecting to find a bumper or a headlight or a wing mirror, but was shocked to find that the body parts in question were human. By which point Spa, on its old MASH triangle layout, was gone from Formula One. It had been deleted from the calendar. It ran its final race on that old layout in 1970 and was cancelled altogether in 1971, again due to safety concerns. In response, the Belgian Grand Prix had a couple of new homes. Zolder was the more well-known location for races while Spa was being redeveloped, but the lesser-known track that they visited was a place called Nivelles, near Brussels. But Nivelles couldn't sustain Grand Prix racing for very long. It held races in 1972 and 1974 and then disappeared for good, leaving just Zolder, which in turn had its own incidents. One of those is the very high-profile fatal accident of Gilles Villeneuve in 1982. But in 1981, Ocella mechanic Giovanni Amadeo was run over in the pits by Carlos Reutemann and later died of his injuries. That same weekend, as the race started, Riccardo Patrese stalled his arrows and mechanic Dave Luckett ran onto the track to give him a push start, only for Patrese and Luckett to be hit by the other arrows of Siegfried Sturr. The race continued for 2 more laps before the other drivers noticed the injured mechanic and they voluntarily red flagged the race. There were a couple more cancellations of the Belgian Grand Prix into the 21st century, the first being in 2003 when Bernie was locked in a bit of a row with Belgian authorities over tobacco advertising, and then again in 2006 when the circuit owners couldn't get the upgrades completed in time, those upgrades being what you see today with the new chicane and those kinds of things. I nearly said bits and pieces like that, but I stopped myself. And in turn, this isn't the first time that Spa had been considered to go on rotation. Back in the early 2000s, Bernie put forward the idea of rotating Spa with the Nürburgring as opposed to it being the Nürburgring and then Hockenheim. On top of this, races in countries have rotated between tracks before. Brands and Silverstone used to rotate back in the 60s and 70s, as well as Hockenheim and the Nürburgring into the 2000s. So the Belgian Grand Prix has a lot of history. History that will no doubt spawn a lot of storytime videos as I look back at the, well, history of the Belgian Grand Prix. But is this rotation thing a good thing or a bad thing? It's actually a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. There is a case for both sides, even if many who are complaining are blinded by the nostalgia of a classic race being off the calendar for a couple of years. On one hand, we still get to see a lot of Spa, but on the other hand, you'd think that a circuit so universally loved by the fans who go there, the drivers that race there, and the massive grids on iRacing whenever it's on the schedules would sort of get a free ticket to always being on the calendar. But with all of this comes the hosting fees. Now I know what the default reaction to this will be. Just give them a discount. But as I've said loads and loads and loads of times in comments and in videos, it's not as simple as just do this. I think this is a trap that Formula 1 might have inadvertently fallen into. With the newer additions of the likes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Vegas and Miami, although Vegas gets a little asterisk next to it because Formula 1 subsidises that race, those circuits are paying big money to have their long-term deals in place. Something like 10 years for the race in Jeddah or whatever it is at a cost of millions that are probably easily 3 figures of millions. If the rights holders say, okay Spa, we'll give you a big discount because you're Spa. Some of the other circuits that are historical but not as historical, like Montreal, Suzuka, Interlagos and the Hungaroring, they're probably going to go, well if they're getting a discount, why aren't we getting a discount? And when the renewals are up for the newer tracks, they're probably going to want to get a discount as well because they think that they're worth it and so on and so forth. I've probably just overthought that so much that it's probably not even relevant, but I thought it was an idea to stick in. These hosting deals are rather complex and opaque. There is another problem, and that problem being that there's almost too many locations to hold races now. If Formula 1 could run like NASCAR and have a race every weekend, you just know that they would. And I remember a time when 18 or 19 races a season was considered excessive. Now, we're at 24, and burnout amongst the mechanics and drivers with all the travelling is becoming more of a concern. This belief that those mechanics are paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to see the world? Ha! No. And I've talked to some of them. It's getting bad out there. There is a balance to be found of having a true world championship that visits every continent on the planet, except Antarctica obviously, and have a couple of races on each continent, but at the same time trying to keep a decent European core. Back when I started watching Formula 1 in the mid to late 90s, most of the races were in Europe. In the 1996 season, 5 of the 16 races were outside of Europe. Australia, Brazil, Argentina, Japan and Canada. In 1990, 6 of the 16 were outside of Europe. In 1966, it was just 2 races outside of Europe. Admittedly, it was only a 9-race season, and I don't know what that is as a percentage, nor do I know what the percentage of outside of Europe races was in 1996. But either way, it shows just how international the sport has become over the last, 50, 60 years. But just how international is the season these days? In 2024, the first 6 races of the season were held outside of Europe, already exceeding the 1996 tally. In total, 14 of the 24 races in the 2024 Formula 1 season were outside of Europe, meaning that nowadays there are more races outside than inside. Although, depending on whether Azerbaijan is classed as Europe or Asia, can bump that number up to 15 races. And the reason I say that is because when Baku hosted its first Formula 1 race back in 2016, it was billed as the European Grand Prix. At the same time, during the 2021 Euro Championships, the football thing, a lot of the teams played games in Baku. But the question is, can Spa being on rotation be sustainable? A couple of people I've seen online have been quick to mention how screwed both the Nürburgring and Hockenheim got when they were rotated. Spa is a tiny bit different in a way because Spa has several high-profile events there every year, and not just Formula 1. There's the 24-hour race in GT3, there's the WEC race, it hosts many other races every year in other categories, and Wikipedia is showing 17 high-profile events for 2025. It doesn't need Formula 1 as badly as some other circuits do. But as some experts, and by experts I mean journalists at Autosport, have been writing, this might just be the beginning. Because Silverstone and Monza spring to mind. There's that statistic that the British Grand Prix and the Italian Grand Prix are the only 2 ever-present events in Formula 1, and with the grid being split between Britain and Italy, that does make sense. Okay, Sauber is in Switzerland, but Switzerland is a mashup of Italian, German and French. I thought I'd Mentioned that before someone started the "you forgot" thing, and even GM, when they enter, will have a staging ground in Britain, despite being the all-American F1 team. On top of this, Silverstone's issues have been long documented. There's a scare story nearly every year in the motorsport press about how Silverstone is struggling and is working out a new deal to survive and keep on hosting Formula 1. And on top of that, you've got the stories of ticket prices getting hiked through the roof. I did a video on that last year. I think it was actually my most popular video of 2024. But somehow, Silverstone always seems to pull through, and it always sells out. Every single year. Even back in the early 2000s when our championship hopes rested on, well, David Coulthard. Compare that to the Dutch Grand Prix. Even with Max's popularity and those two songs, that's going to be gone after 2026. But, and this is a hot take and feel free to disagree at your leisure, would the Dutch Grand Prix have the same attendances if Max wasn't there? Answers on a postcard. And then you've got Monza, the home of the Tifosi. If the Italian Grand Prix went from the Formula 1 calendar, there would probably be riots. I mean, you can replace Monza with Imola and put that on rotation, so that kind of saves it a little bit. Silverstone, though, is a lot more difficult. There aren't any other tracks in the United Kingdom that Silverstone can rotate with. And don't say Brands Hatch, it's not happening. But it's actually okay, for now anyway, because the Italian Grand Prix deal is locked in until 2031 and the British Grand Prix is locked in until 2034. They're staying on the calendar, so any sort of major worries about these tracks being put on rotation or these events being put on rotation have been, I don't want to call them an overreaction, but certainly premature. But having been around the internet over the last couple of days, it does appear that fans are a little bit upset that Spa won't be on every year, and there are the fears that some of the other tracks could go the same way. Some are going as far as to say that Silverstone, Monza and Spa should be granted some sort of special status, that they are on the calendar no matter what, and the only reason Monaco gets to stay is because of its historical significance rather than the fact that it's a loved track. Those three if you're one of the Get Monaco Gone lot, are the crown jewels of Formula 1. Silverstone was where the 1950 season and the Formula 1 World Championship got going. Monza is the home of the Tifosi and the Cathedral of Speed, and Spa is the driver and fan favourite where the spirits of Stefan Beloff, Alan Stacey, Chris Bristow hover in the Ardennes. A track that still has an element of danger about it while still hosting top-level series in 2025, while the Nürburgring became a shadow of its former self. So what's the status of the contracts for each race then? Where could things be moved around, if indeed they get moved around? The Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix, San Marino Grand Prix, is one looking set to go at the end of this coming season, as its deal runs out at the end of 2025. It could end up being rotated, but that's a wait-and-see approach. It's technically Ferrari's home race, and if the Belgian Grand Prix goes off for a couple of years, Imola is a prime replacement if it has to go that way. The Mexican Grand Prix will also have its contract expire at the end of 2025, and with Sergio Perez not being on the grid this year, the crowds might drop enough for it to be a case of, well, what's the point if nobody's turning up? Given that Bortoletto will have his home crowd support at Sao Paulo, and so will Colapinto if he ends up in that Alpine at the end of the year. Vegas also has its initial contract up at the end of 2025, but there is the option to extend it for another 10 years to 2035. So this takes us into the event contracts running out in 2026. The first is the Dutch Grand Prix, and we've already discussed that, so we'll just move on. Also up at the end of the first season of the new regulations is the Azerbaijan Grand Prix in Baku, along with the Spanish Grand Prix, which is set to move to a street race in Madrid that year and will be the Madrid Grand Prix, which has its own contract, which means that the Spanish Grand Prix at the Circuit de Catalunya could be under threat. The third race up at the end of 2026 is the US Grand Prix at Austin, and would Formula 1 be willing to lose that and just keep Vegas and Miami? In 2028, the current deal with the Singapore Grand Prix runs out, and this was a deal that started in 2022. 12 months later, the deal with the Canadian Grand Prix at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve expires, along with the deal that keeps the Japanese Grand Prix on the calendar. The Canadian and Japanese Grand Prix being two long-standing and popular events, and fans would want to see some protection for those two races. Into the next decade, there's China, Abu Dhabi, Austria, Brazil and Saudi Arabia expiring in 2030. Belgium in 2031, which we've already looked at, and then Italy expiring in 2031 as well. Miami and Monaco also expire in 2031, Hungary in 2032, Qatar in 2032, the British Grand Prix in 2034, and Australia in 2035. Bahrain currently has the longest deal that expires in 2036. So at the minute, there doesn't seem to be that much to worry about. Silverstone's going to be around for a while, so is Monza, Suzuka, Montreal, and Interlagos. The problem then starts to manifest itself when they get to renewing those contracts. Do they lock them in for longer deals, and do they keep them a sort of, well, hopefully permanent fixture, or do they do what they just did with Belgium? But like mentioned, if you're a glass half full type of person, then there's going to be races at Spa between now and 2031, with the exception of 2 years. There will be more races at Spa than not at Spa, but most of you will be, well, why not all of those years? But as mentioned, those contracts are very complex. There must be something going on because it was all agreed to, and if Spa didn't like it, then they might have walked away, and as I said before, Spa has a lot more than F1 going on through the year. But as many are going to be asking, what will happen to the likes of Imola? Now, Imola might not be a big loss because Monza is still there for a fair few years. The Dutch Grand Prix will be gone, but Spa and the Red Bull Ring will happily host the Orange Army. Mexico will probably be gone for a long time because no Checo, no party, so that's 3 circuits that free up space. The Spanish Grand Prix will likely be replaced by Madrid full-time, so that's another one gone by 2027, but Baku might stay, simply because there's the money there to pay for it. The US Grand Prix might go, and we could just be left with the Miami and Vegas monikers instead. So actually, don't replace them. Leave things as they are as they drop off. Bring 24 races down to something like, I don't know, 20, 21, and sort of leave us not being F1'd out by the time we reach the Singapore Grand Prix, or just beyond that, but I don't know. Would you like to see more classic races return in replacement of the ones that are dropping off, or do you want the calendar to be shorter? Leave any ideas down in the comments section and get a discussion going. So then, a look at the Belgian Grand Prix situation and how this might affect some of our best loved and historic events and circuits in the future. If this thing has made you think things about the thing, then like this thing so I know I did a good thing. And for more things from the channel, click the subscribe button thing and ring the bell thing so you never miss out on any thing that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the rad lads at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help pay the bills around here, then there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates, and other bits and pieces and things like that that you might want or need to know. Ha! Got it in there eventually. Or there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.